But what I want to do is kind of start from the beginning and walk you through some of our thinking of how we came to this idea. And some of the things I'm showing are actually part of what our initial proposal to SALT, well, then it was not SALT yet, but to Gerantikultur was, and this kind of set of principles that we laid forward. And I mean, more than anything, I want to kind of ask some questions about how identity systems might function today. When you talk about corporate identity, I mean, there's a number of things that come to mind. You think of these kind of, first of all, like a kind of 1950s era and onward of kind of stable corporate identities that represent a company, that are somewhat inflexible or unchanging, represented in a variety of contexts in a consistent way. And we think a lot about marks, we think about logos, and of course this is a little bit of a shorthand. I mean, obviously we know now that you know, that's not the way that things work with companies and how they communicate, but at least as a shorthand, it's where I think when people think about identity systems, they still have this often in their head. I mean, of course, like MTV in the 1980s was one of the people who were making a very interesting identity system that was constantly being changed. And I mean, one of the interesting things about that system as well was that they were inviting artists such as Beth B, Dara Birnbaum, Robert Longo, Judith Butler to kind of work on, to make these animated logos and to actually constantly be changing the identity system. And another keystone in our thinking about this identity program in particular, in general, but also very particularly here, is Stuart Brand's book, How Buildings Learn, which is a really interesting book that looks at how different rates of change within buildings. And of course, I think that this is also, there's a broader metaphor here. I mean, I like to think about identity not just as making a building, but as actually a kind of master planning process, a process whereby you set up a set of, a number of parameters, but then you allow for it to develop over time. But, you know, one of Brand's very interesting ideas is this idea of shearing layers. The idea that there are some parts of a building, like its essential structural characteristics, which are fixed, and when you put them in, you don't ever really change them. But then there are a number of other things which can change at different rates, and what happens is in a typical building, as if, you know, in a building that's older, it starts to have these multiple layers that actually, some of which are old and permanent, some of which are constantly changing, and of course that's something that we can see here in this building as well, very, very clearly. So I think that this is a kind of interesting metaphor to also think about in terms of visual and graphic identities. And then there's also, in a lot of our work, we think a lot about temporalities and different kind of ways that time plays itself out. I mean, another kind of key point in our thinking is The Shape of Time by George Kubler, and thinking about objects that, basically thinking about the relationship, the formal relationships between different works, not as being a chronological sequence, but being actually an atemporal sequence, where you can have something that actually is very discontinuous in time, but is related to something else, and it forms a way to get away from a simply chronological sequence of things, but rather talk about influence and talk about formal relationships. And you know, you can think about kind of asynchronous kind of changes and things also. I mean, very obviously, every time we go to Wikipedia, whether or not we strip, if we don't strip away the layers of it, we see on Wikipedia a thing that many people are contributing to, and which is, you know, constantly changing. And we can, of course, peel back the layer and see when it was changed, and have a date timestamp that tells us exactly when a given word was changed. And I mean, this to us is also a very interesting idea, the idea that you can actually make an identity system which reveals the time of its own making. In fact, that it's somehow encoded in any more subtle or obvious or explicit way when a thing was made. When we first came to Granti, or actually not when we first came to Granti, but when we came to them the second time, we were thinking about a number of different ways how SALT could be visualized. And one was actually something that'll look quite familiar. This is very close to what we ended up with in a way, but we were thinking about it in slightly different ways. We were actually thinking about it as a kind of itself, a kind of system that could change, that you could have these 4 letters that would constantly be changing in these algorithmic ways, in these randomly generated ways, and this would form the kind of basis of the identity system. And you know, and we kind of said from the very beginning, it's really important to us that this not be thought of as a logo. It's not actually a mark, but it's actually part of a custom typeface. And the custom typeface, we called it Kralice, and it's but it's actually it was called Kralice because it was based on a typeface by the German type designer Timo Gessner, who designed a typeface called Queen around like 2002 to 2004. And so this is kind of one of the versions of Queen. Actually, this is a later version of Queen. In the earlier versions of it, it had a number, I'll talk a little bit about it, but Timo is a designer whom we knew from Berlin, and this typeface of his was quite interesting. It's a kind of geometric sans serif that both has a kind of clunkiness to it, but it also has some interesting characters, and it seemed like a nice thing for us to try here. And actually, you can see some of the weirder things, like that N there, which is like very 90s and techno-like in a way. But I should go back in time and say, in the beginning when we were meeting with Granti, we'd actually shown them a second direction that was quite different from this. And so the second direction was actually the idea that we kind of came to them with, on the one hand, this thing that was formally quite, worked out in a way. On the other hand, almost a thing that functioned as a proof of concept. We said, well, why do you need one typeface? You actually could have many typefaces. You could have as many typefaces as you want. And, you could just set salt on all of these things, and, you could have a kind of matrix of them. But if you embedded these typefaces into a kind of standardized ground, let's say a kind of a nice serif typeface, contemporary serif, in fact, it could handle this. You could still have this idea of embedding letters, and by having the consistency of these different letters of the basic typeface, you could actually put in anything there, and it wouldn't matter. And these are some of the early sketches we showed them. We said, well, and you could end up with this kind of diversity of things where, as you make different applications, you have all these kind of overlapping layers of typographies growing over time. And so that was the kind of second idea that we presented to them. Here's the kind of, in a way, like the two ideas next to each other. And so the interesting thing is, and I actually want to say now that I think that that's one of the amazing things for us working with SALT has been that they actually said to us, well, the first direction is quite nice, it looks really good, but the second direction is far weirder, and it's far more challenging, and we don't know if it'll work, so we should really do that. And that's kind of why I love them. So we said, okay, let's think about that. And from the very beginning, the very first time that we met with them, one of the things we were really interested in was the idea that SALT and the identity system could be not just a graphic identity, but it could actually be a way in which you create a kind of community, and that actually you could actually invite other designers into the system and have them participate in it. In the beginning, we weren't quite sure how that would work, but now it suddenly became very clear how that would work, because we thought, well, you could start with this identity system, and it has a very fixed character, and this is the kind of first iteration of it. But what you can start to do is you can start to invite other graphic designers to come in and change these letters, change the S-A-L-T, and actually each time they do this, you can re-release the typeface, and it will become a kind of ongoing system, a kind of curated exhibition system within the identity. And so the identity system becomes a kind of venue itself. And so here's some just like sketches that we have made to show them what that idea might look like. What might happen if you start to embed other typographies within the basis of Pralice. So, and one thing is that the identity manual itself, the identity guidelines, themselves are a kind of implementation of the system. And the idea is also that whenever this identity guidelines PDF is updated, whatever the most current version of the typeface, Pralice, that is in use, will be implemented here as well. So this thing will actually change. If you make a new version of it, make some changes and make a new version in 9 months, it'll be a very different manual than it is now. And so it essentially lays out the different principles for the identity system, how the kind of actual identity works, the typeface itself, and the very important principle that there is no fixed logo mark. There isn't actually a file, like an EPS file or a JPEG or a TIFF, that says SALT. Anytime SALT is used, it is used in language. And so that's why the mission statement has become a graphic that's been used in a number of contexts, but it's not a mission statement that's set in a fixed block. It's just text. It's all about the identity of the institution being embedded within its own communications. And so this is quite important. And the other thing is that this plays itself out also in the idea of distribution, because, for example, if SALT is going to support an exhibition in some other venue, and somebody asks them, well, can we have your logo to put it on there? put it on our sponsor board, then actually Salt will say, no, here's our typeface, please typeset this. And what it actually does is it kind of takes the typeface and puts it out into the world in a number of different ways, so that it might find some uses that are unexpected. And of course the identity manual goes through the kind of different principles of how kind of layouts are constructed and grids and how you typeset things and what's right and what's wrong, how you make sure that it doesn't look too much like the 1990s. Not that I have a problem with the 90s, I love the 90s. But so, and then it also kind of lays out the idea of change. Within the kind of actual identity manual, it actually talks about how this system will change. So it's a kind of, it's integrated completely into the identity system so that anybody who is part of the institution also kind of understands that there are going to be systems in place and that over time, the way that the institution looks will be kind of evolving. And then finally, here were just our things that were the applications for the actual thing. This facade, which by Corey, who is here, which did not happen, sadly. But also then other kind of permanent applications. One of the kind of core ideas, and I know Corey has done a beautiful job of implementing this also within the wayfinding system, is the idea that certain things are fixed and certain things change. So, for example, you might have an application like signage which never changes, and so it's created in the first version of the typeface. And the letterhead, for example, is also created in the first version of the typeface. But as you make things over time, for example, all of the examples here are shown with this first version of Prelice, but actually just try and envision in your head that as you kind of make new applications and make, for example, communications and advertisements for exhibitions, it'll always be changing. There will always be different typefaces. And so there are these different shearing layers, these layers of things that are permanent and these layers of the identity which actually change. And one of the places where it'll change very quickly is on the website, which right now there's a kind of preliminary website in place, and a more complete website is going to be launched in the next couple of months. And it will have the principle that any given page of the website will use the version of Prelice that is current at the moment that the page is created. So if you create a page now on the website, it will, it will look like something like this, and if you create a page in 9 months, it will actually look radically different. And so, in fact, as you flip through the website, you will be able to see the different times that things were made, and the other temporal relationships might start to emerge that otherwise wouldn't be obvious. And I mean, I just threw this in here because, I mean, some things are changing very fast. Like, I came here this morning and it looks radically different than it did just a couple of hours ago. And like, there are these billboards up that I just photographed before I came to the talk that are going to come down today. So, it's kind of the nice and the weird and nice thing for us in all of this has been the kind of agility of the organization. The fact that the organization itself is open to the idea of change and the idea that things, rather than being static, are in flux, and rather than running away from that, really embracing it. So thank you very much, and that's what I have to say.